All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming after the coffee break. I'm Tiffany Farriss. I'm the CEO of Palantir.net and the treasurer of the Drupal Association. And this morning I'm going to talk about decision making at scale, how a little bit of a behind the scenes peek at how I ran the Drupal Marketplace discovery process. So in Tuesday's Drees Note, we talked, you heard both Tim Lennon and I describe that, yes, we are going to move forward with the marketplace, and he's now in charge of that process moving forward. But I thought I would take this as an opportunity to rewind the clock and show you what you might not have seen. The process was very intentional because I think anytime you're dealing with a process that has so many stakeholders, and one of the beautiful and challenging things about our Drupal community is every person rightfully believes that they are a stakeholder in big decisions. Anything that happens on Drupal.org, we feel such an intense passion sometimes about. And so what I really want to do is just talk about how I used really large scale and participatory design thinking around how I structured that whole decision-making process. So this is that story. So in DrupalCon Atlanta, Dries in his keynote posed a question. Often in Drupal, we end up with a vision and you're definitely going. But what was different about what Dries said is it was actually a question. Should we do this marketplace? And if we should do this marketplace, how would we do this marketplace? And I want to back up, a quarter to the earlier this year. In the first quarter, as a member of the Drupal Association board, I had been tasked with leading the innovation subcommittee, and as part of that work, I led, a committee of like 12 people, which I thought was pretty big, and through a working group process that was, was very active. I don't like sitting in a meeting where I'm talked at, and I certainly don't intend to do that. If I have 12 board members or board members and community members either. So it was very much steeped in liberating structures, which I'll talk about later, but there are these little micro practices that you can put together to start to get ideas out on the table. So Dries had never really been in one of my working groups before, and he really liked it. So we fast forward to the board retreat right before Atlanta, where I was voluntold that I wasn't going to be leading the innovation working group anymore for the Drupal Association. He's like, I kind of have a slide in my keynote that says that you're going to run the marketplace thing. And I said, oh, okay, let me start to think about this. Because it wasn't just about, can we get to a yes or no? Are we going to do this marketplace? But it really was that question of, if we should do this, how we could do this, and to go back to the board with a recommendation that felt very steeped in buy-in from the community. Also balance the needs of the Drupal CMS leadership team, and no pressure, but I had to do it pretty fast because the idea was that we needed to have not just a go no go decision by Vienna, but we actually need to have this thing implemented, so the discovery couldn't take forever. So I thought a little bit about how I would do it, and for me, I started by creating this roadmap, and the roadmap was really like, I'm going to give myself 16 weeks. Ultimately, the process took 14 weeks, but I started with this roadmap, and I said, okay, if we're going to do this, I'm going to break it down into this sequence, and then I'm going to think about a process that goes from starting with the community input every time. Then they'll do some synthesis on that. A lot of it I actually did myself in preparation for the working group. I would synthesize it a little bit so that the working group, when we met, could focus on analysis of it and then move forward into decisions that then would go right back out as share-outs. So there was this cadence and an ambition. So in the roadmap, which I did in a spreadsheet because that's my love language, I set out and I said, okay, this is what the working group is going to do this week. This is the share out that goes out this week. This is the Slack prompt that goes out this week. This is the survey. So really broke it down into all the different components and what was happening, so that what was happening this week was analyzing results we had gotten the previous week, and then starting to prepare the materials that we would need to have reviewed by whether it was a working group or our volunteers the following week. So, no plan survives contact with the actual event, but this one survived pretty well, I will say. So, and I think the reason it did is that there were 5 guiding principles to how I wanted to approach this work. The first was this idea of co-creation. I engaged all the different stakeholder groups. This wasn't something we were going to design in isolation. Everything needed to be very transparent. I was going to do these real-time share-outs back with the community so that they kind of knew where we were going, because I wanted there to be no big reveal at the end. This needed to feel iterative. And when I've seen our community go through a process like this at its most frictionless, it generally is because you're kept in the loop all the time, and by the time you get to the end of the process, you're like, of course, obviously, why didn't you get there sooner? That was what I wanted at the end of it. It was just no drama, and people would absolutely feel like they had been heard, even if they didn't totally agree and they had concerns. They weren't really upset about it. So that's part of the idea that of trust first, right? I wanted it to be something that where the community's buy-in and legitimacy was not an afterthought. It wasn't the thing that happened last. It was the thing that happened every single week as we approached it. And it needed to be ethics forward. If we're going to go through this process, there's this concept that Cory Doctorow talks about enshittification, where things get worse over time. And we've seen that with a lot of other marketplaces. And there was such palpable concern on the part of the community, particularly if we are going to offer both free and paid templates. There's a tension in there. So we wanted to make sure that it was very ethics forward. But then that also begs the question. Part of the reason that we would do this is that every single dollar the Drupal Association makes is done so that we can invest in the community collaboration platform that we provide to everyone, right? So at a minimum, the marketplace had to break even. Ideally, it would pay into innovations we can continue to add to Drupal.org. But while I'm very concerned as a treasurer of the DA with that hat on about sustainability and community, there is still a very valid concern about how do we support our contributors who make the modules that all of this work would be built on. So one of the things questions that the community wrestled with and that we thought a lot about in the working group was, how might we do this a little bit differently? How might we use this as an opportunity, if and when it is successful, to start to create that regenerative ecosystem so that our contributors could really start to get rewarded as well and have their work be sustainable. So all of this together made this very lightweight governance scaffolding. And I think, ultimately, since we all know that the process finished, here's how it ended up playing out. There were 8 public share-outs. My original plan was that there would be 12. There were 10 Slack prompts, and I originally thought there'd be 14. There were 4 surveys, and I originally drafted 6. There were 2.5 live sessions. I thought that there would be 4. But at the end of it, we had over 500 community inputs along this process. I thought it would be a 16-week process, and it turned out to be 14. And part of that was that we started to see repeats. Nothing new was coming up. And that's how I knew we had captured it. We really started to have this air of inevitability. Haven't we already answered that question before? Haven't we already asked that question before? So the process itself was very adaptive as we went through it. And at the end, as you know from the Dries note, we did the board did come back and fund both a feasibility study, which is when I turned the work over at the end of July to Tim Lennon, the CTO of the Drupal Association, to start to look at the feasibility for how it actually would get built. And then we also at the same time funded the pilot conditionally, so that then we didn't have to come back to the board again for more money, and it was also already reserved. So at the core of it was this marketplace working group, which included a lot of people who were very busy. So I think a lot about being respectful of the time that people put into the work in a working group. The working group itself had two community elected representatives to the board, Ryan Zrama and Alex Moreno. Ryan's also a Drupal certified partner, as am I. There was almost the entire Drupal CMS leadership team. So Dries was at every meeting, Christina, Tim, Gabor, Lowry, Emma, everyone was invited. And then there was DA staff. There was Tim Lennon, Tim Doyle, and Lenny. So what we ended up doing was having 6 very structured sessions, and the 7th I put on there. That was when I handed it off to Tim. That's all him now. And what we thought about was, again, if I have this roadmap of how I'm trying to move this forward, how do we both have the working group focus on that analysis piece and start to move forward so that we can take all of these hundreds of community voices and opinions and really start to package it into this very coherent strategic direction. We wanted every single decision that we made to be based on community input and then shared back very transparently. And one of the concepts that we use a lot at Palantir, not unique to us, is this idea of consent. I was looking for consent from the community, I was looking for consent from the board, and consent is based on two things. Is it good enough for now, and is it safe enough to try? Like, we're not going to know all the things, and we're not going to answer all the questions, but it's really important that we started with that frame for everyone, because we did have these two audiences at the same time that the working group was trying to communicate with and meet the needs of. We're trying to communicate out to the board to have some sort of recommendation for the funding, and then we also had the community that really needed to think that this was a good idea to try. And in order to do that in those working groups I mentioned before, that I did use liberating structures. One I use a lot, both in the real-time collaboration sessions that we did and in those working group meetings, is one called 1, 2, 4, all. And if you're not familiar with it, you start and give a prompt or a question, and you think about it as one person. And then I would break people into groups of 2, and then I would take those groups of 2 and combine them into groups of 4. And then those groups of 4 would come back and share with the whole group. And what you find is that when you do that, you actually get all the ideas on the table much more quickly. And everybody's actually talking in these meetings, and we're starting to move forward. And so that's how, in just these 6 sessions, we were able to get that entire group aligned and process some incredible volumes of data. As I walked through it, one of the first practical tools that I used was something called an assumption slam. You may be familiar with assumption mapping, and an assumption slam is the same thing, except it's time boxed. Every single thing I did here had to be time boxed, but it also had to be legitimate. It's a very structured method for identifying and prioritizing critical risks. There's a lot of assumptions that about a marketplace or about what the project would need that we all entered into. And so, as I mentioned before, when I would prepare for each of those working group sessions, I would put the things that I had already heard and I expected to come up in the meeting already on the stickies. So then what the group did initially when they were in their just reviewing it on their own, is they would read through that and only add new things. So again, I'm trying to expedite and really make the best use of everyone's time. But what it allowed us to do is to be able to name what could go wrong, to start from that perspective. And throughout the process, you may find I use a lot of chilies, right? I really lean into, and I'm like, all right, what's the thing that's going to get spicy? I want you to say it. I want you to bring it up. We even did this in the community. We're constantly surfacing these tensions. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about it as early as possible. So as we went through and created this assumption slam, we then said for every single one of the ones that we found that were in that upper right quadrant, right, that actually had high impact and high uncertainty, right? Those are the ones you really have to pay attention to. We created validation for those assumptions. Like, how would we actually know, how could we test those assumptions to see if they were true? Because if your assumptions start to fail, then your entire plan and your entire process starts to fall. So this was actually the very first activity after we came together as a group and started to form what we did. So this gave a lot of transparency, both to us collectively as a working group, but then we could, again, communicate with the board, communicate with the community. What do we know? What do we not know? What do we want to learn through this process? And this is a very lightweight way of risk management. That's what I was doing. One of the other practical tools I did was there was a lot of both live inputs and asynchronous validation as a global community. Not everybody is going to be able to get on a live call at the same time. So what I wanted to do is to really layer it in. So it's a 3-step process. Weeks ahead of time, I would have the Slack prompts start to prepare so that I could validate the survey or the live real-time collaboration sessions that I would do. And then the surveys were already prepared before I went into the collaboration sessions. I would take the outputs of those sessions, and you can see up here, this is one of the Miro boards that we used in the first real-time collaboration session, which was on May 1st. I would use that to then tweak the survey before the survey would then go out. The survey would be out for about 2 weeks, and then I would synthesize all that information, bring it back to the working group, and then we'd use that for the next step. So it's this process of constantly being a step ahead and at all those different points in the process. So I think what that allowed us to do is to surface nuance and insight rather than things that we kind of already knew. We weren't looking for, we wanted to make sure that we hit those edge cases, that people felt comfortable going to spaces rather than to the obvious place. We wanted them to go to the place that we might not have seen, again, as part of the risk sharing. Another one, this is, if you're familiar with design thinking, the divergence convergence is a design thinking rhythm that balances that kind of exploration with decision making. So I need there to be, in order for there to be an effective discovery process, you really do need to allow that to kind of exist. So the divergence phase kind of casts a super wide net across all those different stakeholder groups, and that's why we use very multi-channel approaches to explore those tensions and those conflicting views. I didn't want anybody to feel rushed. I wanted there to be a lot of space in it. But then we could start to converge. What's interesting is, as I want to point out, in the middle, there's a moment where you're both still diverging and converging in those couple weeks, because we do need to get through this. We needed to get to a recommendation in less than 4 months so that the work could continue. But the overlap is a good reminder that it's not a strictly sequential process when you're in a design thinking kind of phase. But what I loved about the rhythm is it prevents something that, maybe it's never happened to you or you've never seen it in the community, but analysis paralysis is a real thing. And you can get stuck in this phase where you're like, oh, but I don't have the perfect solution. It allows you, that's a sign of too much divergence, you're just too far apart. And then there's also a risk in premature convergence where you can fall into groupthink. You're like, yeah, we already know where this is going to go. You're going to decide too quickly. So I love that tension and allow that to play out. One of the final activities I walked through with the working group was actually user story mapping. And what that allowed us to do is to really validate the contributor journey and start to lay out how we needed to start thinking about the UX design for this. So we mapped end-to-end experiences for the purchaser journey, for the maker journey, and then for the Drupal Association staff. This was how we were starting to set up that feasibility investigation that Tim Lennon was going to do. We all needed to be on the same page. And what's nice about the user journey mapping is that it kind of reveals those friction points, the missing infrastructure, any of the support gaps, because you're thinking at any given point, you're thinking about, okay, what are the user's goals? What are their tasks? What are the requirements? And then you start to surface risks. And then I always put a parking lot in, because these are clever people and good ideas come up at any point. So you want to be able to capture them and then without derailing the conversation that you're in, so that you can stay very focused on understanding what your operational requirements are and the user experience impacts are, so that we can continue to move forward with a reasoned decision. I think the last practical tool that I would recommend out of our work was that we wanted there to be kind of a progressive commitment. So when you go back to the board, I wanted to present it to them and say, let's do the feasibility study and let's go ahead and approve the full budget, one, so that the money is earmarked and we know that we're going to go in this direction, but put a decision gate in the middle that we can say no, that actually the feasibility didn't come up and you can move forward there. So you're only going to proceed to that part 2 if the validation succeeds, otherwise you're going to pivot. So, or stop what you're going to do. So I think it allowed the board to feel really comfortable with the high uncertainty of this effort. And so that was I think it was a really important tool to help us balance the agility. Sometimes we don't always see a lot of agility in the community. There's that famous African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go long, then you go together, right? I needed this both to be together and fast. So I was constantly trying to balance that idea of accountability and agility and participation and agility throughout all these processes in a way that was respectful of both the community investment as well as the organizational resources that moving forward with this project would take. So what did we learn through the process? I think that those structured methods that we used were really much more valuable, much deeper, allowed us to go much further, much more quickly than kind of ad hoc discussions that you often find. Just show up to the meeting and it will come. It doesn't happen that way. I think that really going for controversial topics, whether it was monetization or support or quality, and really addressing those early and often, I think that built a lot of credibility both with the board and with the community. I think the user story mapping helped make clear to everyone, regardless of what lens they were viewing it, what kind of operational requirements would be involved, especially on the part of the Drupal Association staff as we move forward for this. There was a lot of responsive iteration. You could see from the first MVP draft to the second MVP draft, we would drop the listing fee. There were just things that, we said, okay, this is tough, but this is what needs to happen. So there was always iteration and improvement that was demonstrated visibly. I think those clear decision gates between the phases allowed for that kind of adaptation-based learning. And it felt like, okay, I'm not trying to sell you something, I'm really trying to understand, I'm trying to be the facilitator of this process. And part of what made that even possible were those liberating structures. I think that they're if you haven't come across them yet, I strongly recommend, checking them out, because as microstructures, they allow you to design very intentionally interactive and participatory exercises that scale depending on whatever size group you are. If you are 2 people or you are 200 people, they work really well. But this, I think all the ways that we approach this help us to build that kind of trust throughout the entire process, which was very key. So with that, here's some resources. I mentioned liberating structures, the assumption slam. We also use the lean business model canvas. I showed a picture of it up there as we were trying again to surface different pieces of it. But those are the tools that I found really helpful. And I think I did not leave any time for questions, but I tried. But if anybody has any questions, please come up and ask me. I'd be happy to answer them.